So I am actually quite overwhelmed by this and by everything that has been said. And Father Cyril, I think, somewhat exaggerates, but I'll remind him of something he said in Russian in a discussion in Kiev about my modern Orthodox thinkers. It was sent to me by the other person, Konstantin Sigov, and I listened to it, and at one point I managed to work out from the Russian Cyril saying to Constantine, because you must remember that Father Andrew is really a patristic scholar. This book is a kind of hobby. Which is very, very, I thought this was very nice and very sweet, very, very nice thing to say. But I'm very, very deeply touched by being given this award, and I hope that this little lecture that I give is adequate. Is this? No, it doesn't matter. I think I can just about see. So, contemplation in the academy. Contemplation in the academy should not seem an ill-assorted pair. Yet I fear that in our Western world at least, it will be a puzzle for many to see what they have to do with one another. In this lecture, I shall seek to show that indeed they do have much to do with each other, and indeed that without recognizing the place of contemplation, the Academy has little chance of fulfilling anything like its traditional role, either as regards its own purposes or in relation to the society that it seeks to serve. It is also a wide subject that could be approached from many angles. But as the context of most of us is the Western university or systems of education that evoke the university, it seems to me most natural to begin our considerations by looking back to the history of the academy, or more narrowly the university in the West. There are other stories, other ways in which we could approach this subject, but we have to start somewhere, and this is where I'm starting. The medieval university emerged in the 12th century from the monastic and cathedral schools of the early Middle Ages. These schools have preserved elements of the education of classical antiquity after the collapse of the educational system in the West in the 5th and 6th centuries, when the region of what was to become Western Europe slipped from the public administration of the Roman Empire. Bede, in Northumberland, in that little corner of the world, as he called it, where I also live now, at the beginning of the 8th century was one concerned to equip monastic schools for education. For alongside his exegetical and historical works, for which he is famous, he wrote textbooks on grammar and rhetoric, two subjects which, together with dialectic, constituted the trivium, the elementary part of the medieval curriculum, with which the monastic schools are mostly concerned. The trivium enabled one to read and write and think in Latin, providing thereby access to the scriptures and to the liturgy of the Church of the Latin West, and incidentally also to the Latin classics, though this was far from incidental to many of those who benefited from the monastic and later cathedral schools. Beyond the trivium lay the quadrivium, the four-part bit: music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, which completed the so-called liberal arts, the artes liberales. Teaching in monastic schools seems to have advanced this far only patchily. Some of Bede's works advance into the quadrivium with a work on meter, considered part of music, and on the computation of Easter, which involved some knowledge of astronomy. It was this pattern of learning that was inherited by the medieval university. What was the purpose of this learning? In the monastic school, the purpose seems clear enough: to provide literate monks. For monks had to sing the divine office, which involved reading, and be able to make further copies of the scriptures and liturgical books and other works as required. They needed to be able to read and write in Latin. The monastic schools existed to enable monks to fulfill their vocation as monks, and fundamentally that meant to come to know God, who has revealed himself in his creation, in scripture, and in the incarnation, to praise him and to love him. That goal could be described as contemplation, contemplatio. The monastic life was often characterized as consisting of several steps, sometimes 3 or even 5, but most commonly 4: lectio, meditatio, oratio, and contemplatio: reading, meditation, prayer, and contemplation. The early stages were rooted in the disciplines learnt at school, reading and meditation, this latter meaning not what it might mean nowadays in the context of Eastern meditation, but rather trying to grasp the significance of what one had read, by pondering over it, thinking about it, relating one passage from the Bible to another, generally by following suggestions found in the Church Fathers, for it is mostly with Scripture and the Fathers that the monastic lectio was concerned. This reading, thinking, pondering ultimately led the monk to contemplation, to looking at God, being aware of his presence. Such contemplation was not, however, thought of as an achievement, the next step on the ladder, as it were, at which you arrived to if you were sufficiently diligent. For contemplatio, contemplation was rather a gift, something received. The early stages of reading and meditating prepared the monk to receive this gift, made him receptive. But beholding God, felt awareness of his presence was a gift, not an attainment. A gift that could well be given without the preparation provided by the monastic school, for God himself is not limited by human readiness. However, such miraculous illumination was not normal. Augustine had faced this problem long before. The idea that, well, we don't need to learn anything because God will just reveal it. And remarked that the command to love both God and our neighbour entails that we shall want to pass on the fruits of contemplation to our fellow human beings. That is, we shall be inspired to teach, which would make little sense if we had never had to learn in the first place. As he put it in his On Christian Instruction, De Doctrina Christiana, for charity itself, which holds humans together in a knot of unity, would not have a means of infusing souls and almost mixing them together if humans could teach nothing to each other. In the cathedral schools from which the universities evolved, this pattern of learning was detached from the immediate practical context of the monastery, a process carried still further by the university. But the pattern itself was not fundamentally altered. And I'd like now to explore with you a little of what this understanding of learning entails. What we've looked at in its immediate monastic context has a history that goes back to the roots of Western culture, which perhaps gives another reason for heeding what it tells us about the nature of knowledge and learning. This pattern of teaching is first explicitly witnessed in a Christian context, in the address to Origen, often called his Thanksgiving oration, for that is what it is, that Gregory the Wonder Worker gave as he took leave of his beloved teacher Origen after studying with him in Caesarea in Palestine. On leaving, he returned to his native city of Neo-Caesarea in Pontus, where he became a bishop whose influence can be traced in the Cappadocian Fathers. For the grandmother of Macrina, Basil, and Gregory, also called Macrina, had been one of the Wonder Worker's disciples. In the course of his oration, Gregory gives us an account of the pattern of teaching, the curriculum, as it were, at Origen's academy in Caesarea. Origen's purpose for his students, as Gregory makes clear at the very beginning of his oration, was that they will become assimilated to God, using the Platonic sounding extomiousthe to theo, compare the theaetetus, or deification, theosis, as it later came to be called. The way to this goal was a course of study which reminds us, if we need reminding, how different a philosophical school was then from what it is now. Then, when, in the words of the title of one of Pierre Hadot's books, philosophy was a way of life. This study led through training in argument and dialectic to the study of nature. Gregory mentions in particular geometry, irrefutable and loved by all, and astronomy, which leads us to the heights, and thence to moral philosophy and the attainment of the virtues, preeminent of which is love. Then followed theologia, first studied in the Greek philosophers, which finally led to the study of the Holy Scriptures. On the one hand, this pattern of learning is clearly based on the classical system of Paideia. On the other hand, this system has been adapted for Christian use. The goal is to be able to understand the Scriptures and through such engagement to gain assimilation to God. What we find in Origin would continue in the centuries to come, and as we are now coming to understand much more fully through the scholarship of Samuel Rubinson and his colleagues and students, monastic Paideia continued the pattern of learning that we first learn of in a Christian context in Origin. Behind this pattern of monastic learning, as it continued in the East and was recovered in the West, lies the distinction between the active life and the contemplative life, a distinction we've already heard in the lectures at this conference. The vios practicos and the vios theoretikos, a distinction expressed in this form as early as Aristotle, though it is much older. Plato was certainly aware of the distinction too. For Aristotle, this distinction was this was the distinction between the life of worldly activity, the world of business and commerce, the world of farming and manufacture, the world of everyday life, and in contrast, the world of thought. The active life is concerned with doing things and the moral and political questions that this entails. The contemplative life, the vios theoretikos, is concerned with beholding things. The word theoria is derived from a verb meaning to look or to see. Contemplation is then knowledge of reality itself, as opposed to knowing how to get about, how to organize things. The kind of know-how involved in getting things done. To this contrast between the active life and contemplation, there corresponds a distinction in our understanding of what it is to be human. Between reason conceived of as puzzling things out, solving problems, calculating and making decisions, referred to by the Greek words phronesis and theania, or in Latin by ratio, and reason conceived of as essentially receptive of truth, beholding, looking, referred to by the Greek words theoria or sophia, exercised by nous, intellect, and in Latin mostly by the word intellectus, which covers all of those. Augustine expressed this distinction by using scientia for the kind of knowledge attained by ratio, and sapientia, wisdom, for the kind of knowledge received by the intellectus. Human intelligence operates on two levels, a basic level concerned with doing things, and another level concerned with simply beholding, contemplating, knowing reality. Or as the Greek fathers often put it, I alethis ton ondon gnosis, the true knowledge of beings. This contrast can be expressed in various ways. One way, discussed by Aristotle both at the beginning of the Metaphysics and in Book 10 of his Nicomachean Ethics, can be put by saying that in what concerns ratio, we are doing things for a reason. We are doing what we are doing is not done for its own sake, but is done for some purpose. While in what concerns intellectus, or the nous, we are doing things for their own sake. In religious terms, looking at God, gazing upon him, is not done for any reason. There is no ulterior motive. It is done for its own sake. But similarly, in an analogous way, in knowing things created, contemplative knowing of created reality is simply concerned with what they are, rather than with the purposes to which we can put them. In a more modern idiom, this distinction is not unlike Heidegger's distinction between Vorhandensein, the being of things that we are simply concerned with for our own purposes, the things that are at hand that we can use, and Dasein, being for its own sake. There is another distinction, also explored by Aristotle in the places just mentioned. The realm of ratio is simply human. It is a perfectly proper human activity to engage in business, to make things, to set ourselves goals and to try and achieve them. But the realm of intellectus can be said both to fulfill what it is to be human, for it is the exercise of what is highest in human nature, but also to transcend what it is to be human, for contemplation belongs to the gods, as Aristotle puts it. In contemplation, what is highest in human nature finds its fulfillment, and that highest is what is divine in human beings. Human nature finds its fulfillment in transcending itself. But there is something missing in my attempts to summarize what Aristotle thought about the relationship between the active and contemplative lives, an understanding that continued through until the times of the medieval university. And it is missing because the very terms I'm using, terms in modern English, disguise the relationships implicit in Aristotle's Greek or in the schoolman's Latin. We might start with the word school, as in monastic schools, also used to describe the separate divisions of learning in the medieval universities, and still used to describe the various areas of learning in universities. The Latin is schola, the Greek scholi, which means leisure. When Aristotle expressed the relationship between the active and contemplative lives, he says at one point, "For we engage in business in order to have leisure." Or in the Greek, which is much clearer, askolumatha gar ina skolazomen. We are unleisured, we desert leisure in order to be leisured. That's the way round it goes. And Latin has the same idea. The word for business in Latin, negotio, is the negation otium, rest or leisure. Our modern use of language puts this quite the other way about. It is work that is the key term, and leisure is an odd, slightly embarrassing word. Time is not devoted to work. Is time not devoted to work? Time left over. We need leisure, of course, but it is mostly conceived of in the modern world as an opportunity for rest and entertainment, so that we may return to work refreshed. And again, our words betray us. Refreshment is seen as a means to an end, so that we can go back to work sort of more vigorously. It is not the refreshment, the refrigerium, the anapsixis, that we hope for beyond this life of toil and effort. The refrigerium which we pray may be granted to the departed, for instance, as in the prayer for the departed in the Orthodox memorial service. In a place we pray for that they may find a place of light, green pasture and refreshment, en topo fotino, cloero, anapsixios. At the beginning of the 21st century, this is perhaps even more odd, given that technological advance has soaked up much of what human work once had to accomplish, and thus provided human beings, at any rate in the technologically advanced West, with more time of leisure overall than ever before. But to pursue that would be to anticipate. Before I move on, let me make one further etymological point. The word theoria, we noticed, derives from the word in Greek meaning to see, but we notice that it has for Aristotle something of a religious aura, in that it was the exercise of the divine part of human nature. It was a divine activity itself, the occupation of the gods. The Latin word used to translate theoria is contemplatio, which must originally have meant something like what goes on in a temple, referring, I suppose, to the act of beholding the statue of the divinity enshrined in the temple, which is also a connotation of the Greek word theoros, the contemplator. For theoros in Greek also has the meaning of one who is present, present consulting an oracle, present at a festival, present maybe representing the city you come from at the festival of another city. They're not just there to see, they are there to be there. And we should return later to these religious overtones of contemplation. How did this all bear on how human knowledge was understood by the medieval university? And more pressingly, what relevance has that to us today? The medieval monastery, at any rate in its Benedictine manifestation, divided the day into 3 parts, roughly equal in duration, devoted to working, praying, and sleeping. The monk was a man of flesh and blood. He needed to work and eat in order to live. He was certainly engaged in the life of ratio. He needed sleep in order to make that possible, but he also devoted time to prayer, which included contemplation. To that end, the monastic school equipped the monk with enough of the liberal arts to enable him to prepare himself to rise to the life of contemplation, precisely as Origen had intended in his academy at Caesarea. The medieval university focused on the latter part, contemplation, as Sir Richard Southern was beginning to show us in his, alas, unfinished final work, Scholastic Humanism and the Unification of Europe. The medieval universities were engaged in a massive enterprise to recover all the human learning that had become fragmented as a result of the fall of humankind, and more immediately through the laying waste of the achievement of classical culture, but sought to recover this so that, as far as might be possible in a fallen world, the university could once more be contemplated as, could once more be understood as a whole and lead human minds up to contemplation of God. The same pattern can be seen here that had been explored in much greater depth in the Byzantine ascetic tradition, the achievement of such detachment that the university could be contemplated for what it is, that is, created by God, what the Greeks called natural contemplation, and thus lead the mind to contemplation of God himself. The book of nature and the book of creation were understood to be complementary, both capable of being understood in the light of the incarnation of the Word of God, through whom creation came to be, a light of which human beings began to be aware as they sought loving detachment in following the crucified and risen Lord. The schoolmen devoted themselves to this amazing undertaking. The university, the school, was a place of scholarly leisure, where men had, not very many women in those days, but where men had time to think and ponder. And I'd underline that. The purpose of the academy is to provide time for people to think. That's its primary purpose. We don't get much time to do that nowadays, and that suggests how far we have fallen from the ideal that we are pursuing. The enterprise failed, no doubt. The world was still fallen, political and economic turmoil swept their efforts away, though perhaps not so quickly or lastingly as we moderns like to suppose. The endeavour of the schoolmen was also skewed in that they were developing only one part, and perhaps not the richest part, of the Christian tradition. Not that there were not among them those who were aware of the intellectual riches of the Greeks, but the Greeks who were their contemporaries were, as far as they were concerned, politically weak and anyway regarded by them as heretics as a result of the Great Schism. But the universities continued and adapted to the times. And some aspects of that process I just want to turn my attention very briefly to now. The medieval university was a place for the study of the liberal arts that made possible a life of thought, of contemplation. The liberal arts, that is, free arts, as opposed to the servile arts, to which human beings are bound, the liberal arts made possible the exercise of freedom. They made possible the development of what is divine in the human, whereby human nature transcends itself. Contemplation, too, we have seen, is a gift, not the result of labour, but something given and received. Somewhere in the more recent history in the West, all of this began to change. We've already seen that in the way the words we use turn on their head the understanding that sought work as a temporary suspension of leisure in order to make leisure possible, leisure in which one can think and ponder and disinterestedly receive knowledge and understanding as illumination. Immanuel Kant must, I think, have had something to do with it, though he is certainly, I think, a symptom of wider changes rather than the cause of them. Let me just mention 2 points that lead me to think so. First, there are Kant's remarks in the preface to the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, where he speaks of reason constraining nature to give answer to questions of reason's own determining, or as an appointed judge who compels the witnesses to answer questions he has himself formulated. That is the attitude towards nature that Kant, the philosopher, sees adopting. Compelling, constraining, even torture is hinted at, in order to extort truth in accordance with one's own categories. This is not the exercise of intellectus. It's very much the exercise of ratio, with an agenda. And there is no suggestion that there is any place for the contemplative knowing of the intellectus or nous. Indeed, quite the contrary. And secondly, there is Kant's understanding of virtue, where, so I admit I'm oversimplifying, the difficulty of acting virtuously is seen as some measure of its authenticity. Moral virtue is the product of work or toil. Now, no one doubts that virtue is sometimes, even often, difficult. We live in a fallen world. Much conspires to hide the good from us. But the whole of the ancient Christian tradition saw virtue as something natural. For a human being to be virtuous is to act in accordance with his or her true nature, which needs rediscovering, certainly, a true created nature. Indeed, as somebody mentioned earlier today, St. Maximus the Confessor explicitly contradicts Aristotle's view that virtue is not natural, but ethical, ethiki, as it is acquired by ethos, that is, picked up by custom, nurtured by habit, the very beginning of Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics. In contrast to this, Maximus says, no, virtue is natural in his dispute with Pyrrhus in 645. This perception is indeed one that the Christian tradition shares with much other ancient wisdom. The principle of Wu Wei, for instance, in Taoism, has the same sort of idea that behaving virtuously is natural, is going what is in reality the easiest way, even though it may be difficult to discern. Much toil may be required to reverse the effects of the fall. This is the realm of ratio. But the purpose of all this is to make possible the exercise of nous or intellectus, devoting itself to contemplation of God and the created order. Another nail in the coffin of these traditional notions of contemplation that go back, as you've seen, to the roots of Western culture was provided by Karl Marx in his famous comment in the Theses on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in different ways. The point is to change it. Philosophy is precisely not the contemplation of reality. Philosophy is, its real role is to be involved, is to participate in revolutionary struggle. It is certainly in the Marxist notion of the intellectual worker that the classical idea of thinking as contemplation that lies at the root of the idea of the university is finally overthrown or abandoned. The world process is one of revolutionary struggle, in which all are called on to participate by working, including the intellectual, who is to bring his gifts of analysis to elucidating the progress towards the dawn of the final classless society. Though what was to happen then, but what was to happen when that was achieved, always remained rather vague, and certainly had nothing to do with the life of contemplation. What you're seeing in this, admittedly very partial sketch of the history of the university in modern times, is something of much broader cultural import. That what we are seeing is of much broader import can be seen in one of the books I naturally went to when I thought about this lecture, the work which I read so many decades ago that I can't remember anything about it. Though actually in my own experience, things that I read many decades ago I usually do remember, but this I hadn't very well. St. John Henry Newman's The Idea of University, a set of 9 lectures, supplemented by some further occasional lectures and essays, delivered to explain and justify the creation of a Catholic university in Dublin in 1852. The task Cardinal Newman had set himself was to justify the idea of a university, to justify it in 2 contexts. On the one context, to justify having a university founded by the Church, a Catholic university, and on the other hand, to justify the idea of a university against those who felt that it should be something else, some sort of institute. That is, to justify the idea of university, that is, an institution devoted to teaching all the branches of knowledge, including, as Newman included in his early lectures, theology. But in the course of the lectures, he seems clearly on the defensive. Newman doesn't expect to have a ready audience and is constantly sort of coming back to sort of persuade people to listen to him, as it were. As he expounds the idea of university, he betrays, even in the 19th century, 150 odd years ago, a certain anxiety, particularly as he seeks to justify the presence of a faculty of theology in such a university. Newman's argument is simply this, that theology is a branch of knowledge, a science, so that to omit it from the curriculum of a university would be to damage the very notion of a university, with its universal remit implicit in its title. Much as if one were, say, to omit biology, that would also damage the notion of university. That's the example he gives, in fact, alongside theology. He also goes on to say that if you omit an essential element of learning in a university, then what will happen is that contiguous disciplines will, so to speak, encroach on it. Philosophy or ethics, for instance, in the case of theology. They will encroach on an area beyond their competence because of the gap left by the absence of, in this case, theology. But for Newman, theology is simply a branch of knowledge, alongside other branches of knowledge, like history or whatever. And for as Newman puts it at one point, the first time he actually mentions it in those terms, it turns out that there is something considerable is known about the Supreme Being, whether from reason or from revelation, so that an institution that pretends to be a university must include theology. I find that something deeply underwhelming about this argument, which places theology too much on the level of all other branches of knowledge. Although Newman is not excluding what is revealed supernaturally, he is clearly happier defending the notion of a university on natural or rational grounds. And there is a curious high point at the end of the penultimate lecture, the 8th, where he gives an eloquent account of what he calls the gentleman. That is, I think, someone schooled in university education. The idea being basically at Oxford or Cambridge is what he was thinking about, but this is what he's going to introduce into Ireland. And it's a long and very beautiful account. Newman was a very great rhetorician, but I just read some bits of it. Hence it is that it is almost a definition of a gentleman to say that he is one who never inflicts pain. This description This description is both refined and, as far as it goes, accurate. And he goes on to give examples. The true gentleman, in like manner, carefully avoids whatever may cause a jar or a jolt in the minds of those with whom he is cast. All clashing of opinion, or collision of feeling, or restraint, or suspicion, or gloom, or resentment, his great concern being to make everyone at their ease and at home. He obviously never experienced Greek intellectual life, which is not at all like that. Not that he might not hold a religion too, he goes on, in his own way, even when he is not a Christian. In that case, his religion will be one of imagination and sentiment. It is the embodiment of those ideas of the sublime, the majestic, and the beautiful, without which there can be no large philosophy. And he concludes, after many more examples of what it is to be a gentleman, that is a university gentleman, by saying Basil and Julian, the apostate, were both fellow students at the schools in Athens. One became a saint and doctor of the church, the other her scoffing and relentless foe. To be fair, towards the end of the final lecture, there is a companion piece to this description of the gentleman. And this companion piece is a portrait, really, of his own special father and patron, as he calls him, St. Philip Neri. After giving a picture of the age in which St. Philip lived, as traitorous to the interests of Catholicism as any that preceded it or can follow it, he begins an account of his response to this by saying, all this he saw, and he perceived that the mischief was to be met, not with argument, not with science, not by the recluse or by the preacher, but by means of the greater counter-fascination of purity and truth. He did not so much draw his own as draw them to him. He did not seek his own as draw them to him. He sat in his little room, and they, in their gay worldly dresses, the rich and the well-born, as well as the simple and the illiterate, crowded into it. In the mid-heats of summer, in the frosts of winter, still was he in that low and narrow cell in San Girolamo, reading the hearts of those who came to him and curing their souls' maladies by the very touch of his hand. But he doesn't develop this. This is the next end. It's the next. It's a page or two before the end of the lecture. He doesn't develop it, though it seems to me that in that description of St. Philip Neri, Newman did seem to recognize that there was something beyond the kind of university that he was describing, something that could be glimpsed, at any rate, within the university. But the university itself, he accepted as just the way things must be, a purely natural pursuit of knowledge, with the higher aim of the university almost closed off from it. And so it's Newman I call in witness, strangely it might seem, for the loss of the high aim of the medieval university. For his university seems content to produce what to Newman seems to have been an ambivalent, for the passage in the 8th discourse is surely ambivalent. It's often read as if it's, as if not, but I'm sure it is. Of an in some ways admirable figure, but only in some ways admirable, the gentleman. This process was already underway in the 19th century and may be held to have reach its fulfillment at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, with thinkers such as Nietzsche and Heidegger. For in both of them, we find the loss of any sense of the transcendent, save as an object of wistful nostalgia. I think it's important to register this, for the problem of talking about contemplation in relation to the academy, as I am attempting to do in this lecture, is that there is a profound forgetfulness of the traditions reaching back to ancient Greece that lie behind the culture of the West, that once were manifest in the university and to which I've been aiming to appeal and evoke. The metaphysical tradition that is presupposed by the ideas of contemplation from Plato and Aristotle onwards no longer has any purchase, save for those for whom is essentially a religious tradition, not one that and one that informs less and less the world of those among whom we live. So I cannot avoid trying, and doubtless failing, to suggest how such notions of contemplation that I'm wanting to evoke and commend in this context might still have viable currency in the world in which we live. And in what follows, I want to explore very briefly, because there is not much more time, the ideas put forward by an English Benedictine monk, Dom David Foster, in a book published only 4 years ago called Contemplative Prayer, a New Framework, in which, to quote him, he says, putting the point controversially, the problems of contemporary culture that Nietzsche memorably noted as the death of God, which plays into so many of the serious difficulties of contemporary society, calls for contemplatives rather than postmodern relativism and skepticism. It's quite difficult to summarize what is in fact a very tightly constructed book, the result of much and deep thought. But what Dom David has to say is so important that I must at any rate make an effort. The trouble with simply repeating the authentic and in the end deeply Platonic tradition of contemplation and contemplative prayer is simply that this begs the question. Too few of our contemporaries have any notion of the transcendent realm that contemplation was thought to open out onto. I'd make the criticism against myself. The book which Michael referred to and has been referred to several times at this conference, The Origins of the Christian Mystical Tradition, is deeply flawed in one fundamental respect, and that is that it assumes that the tradition I'm talking about still has purchase. And it seems to be quite clearly we live in a society where these ideas no longer have purchase except in a number of small and in a number of small and not very influential areas of the society in which we live. What even Aristotle took for granted, that in contemplation a human activity touches the realm of the divine, can no longer be taken for granted. Dom David takes as his starting point an experience of what he calls liminality, as he puts it. The sense that there are various experiences that seem to disclose an awareness that we are on the edge. We come up against a wall. There is nothing beyond it. And that this applies particularly to people who seek to pray. We find ourselves very quickly, as it were, against a sort of blank wall. There's no reason to suppose anything on the other side of it, but there's a kind of there's something stops. It could be, and in the traditional accounts I've looked at, that this experience of liminality is there, but it is experienced as, or understood as, the experience of reaching a threshold beyond which there is something else. And Dom David wants to suggest that there are ways, if we try to understand more deeply the traditional dimension of contemplation, if we try to unpick what this contemplative attitude really is, we might begin to see the way in which this liminality might become to feel like being on a threshold we might in some way cross. But we can no longer take for granted in the world in which we now live, the world in which we now know it, that this is the case. All Dom David is prepared to claim for this experience of liminality is that it is a consciousness of finitude, a consciousness that we are limited, an experience that lies behind the reflection of those mentors of modernity, as he sees them justly, I think, Nietzsche and Heidegger. As Dom David explores what is meant by contemplation in this narrow context of an experience of liminality, he draws attention to various dimensions of contemplation as thus understood. First of all, he draws on Simone Weil's well-known discussion of school studies, in the collection of works that was published after her death, called Waiting on God in English. And he epitomizes her discussion of attention. The important point, he says, is her observation that, however it is a matter of the intelligence, attention means suspending thought. Not to be unthinking, but to let our thought be free of our agendas and concerns. There needs to be a shift in the center of gravity of our attention, away from us to the object of our attention, so that it can disclose itself. The most precious things must be waited for. They cannot be found. And were we to try and look for them, we would find only false goods, whose falsehood, ironically, we would not be able to discern. He gives another metaphor of what is involved in contemplation, namely listening. To listen well, we need to be aware of the voices in our own heads, our own interests, all that we bring to the conversation that is irrelevant to what the other person has to say. Acknowledgement of what is not relevant and acceptance of it for what it is helps us to set aside, for the sake of the other person. And more than that, a properly attentive listening on our part can help another person articulate better what needs to be said as well as understood. This is only the beginning of an exploration of contemplative experience that I cannot follow in detail now. What our Dom David is doing is exploring the underside, as it were, what it feels like to cultivate a contemplative attitude, drawing on a whole variety of mainly philosophical sources, not least Wittgenstein, to construct a framework in which contemplation begins to make sense. And towards the end of the book, he summarizes what he has attempted thus. I tried to show how prayer springs from the point where our conceptual thinking starts, from the very basis of human experience. I started from the idea that even when God seems most remote and absent and prayer most unreal, the heart of what is involved in prayer is disclosed. The concrete finitude, the frustrations as well as the desires, hope and ambitions of our life bring us to limits which can seem a brick wall but can become a threshold of opening our hearts to a sense of a beyond. I think it's a sign of hope, too, that Dom David is not alone in finding a kind of apophatic notion of contemplation, a key to understanding the seemingly God-forsaken world that modern man finds himself to be inhabiting. There's a little-known book called The Measure of Things, Humanism, Humility and Mystery, by my one-time colleague in Durham, David Cooper, in which he sought to find a way between what he sees the fundamental problem of philosophical epistemology nowadays, a way between a scientistic absolutism on the one hand and a postmodern relativism on the other. One which affirms a clear possession of truth, but at the same time has no real way of justifying that it is truth. And then a postmodern relativism which says, well, there's no truth anyway. Forget about it. By arguing that the ultimate, however we call it, must be something that we can say absolutely nothing about. In that case, it can actually operate, it can function as a guarantor of our attempts to know. And this seems to be, in a purely philosophical vein, something like what Dom David is trying to explore from the inside, as it were. Both of them draw us back to the fundamental place that contemplation understood in this sort of apophatic awareness that enables what we are beholding to be, needs to play in our attempts to understand the world in which we live, to restore, I would suggest, an insight that lies at the heart of what we call the academy. There are other factors in our society that militate against acceptance of the value of contemplation, particularly in an academy. The most important of which, it seems to me, is the way in which non-productive time is no longer publicly valued. We've already noticed the way in which our notion of work and leisure inverts the way in which these are related in the classical languages of the West. The consequence of that inversion goes deep. Non-productive time is what is left over from work. It is a time for rest, so that we might return to work refreshed. More insidiously, non-productive time is when we become not producers, workers, but consumers. And the leisure industry and advertising conspire to make that leisure productive and then catch us in a kind of spiral from which we can't escape. The positive valuing of non-productive time was encouraged in the past, and not too distant past either, by the provision of holidays. Sundays and other religious feast days, therefore called holidays, holy days. First, Protestantism reduced sharply the number of religious feast days, and then an odd alliance of consumerism and impatience with the tiresome variability of the feasts dependent on Easter sought to sever the link between holidays and the holy, a process which has gone almost as far as it can in English society. Not quite. We still have feasts directly related to Easter, but others have gone. Ascension, Whitsun, and so on. But the principle of these feasts also goes back to the beginnings of what we know as civilization in the West. And it is a contemplative religious principle. In the laws, Plato tells us that the gods, in their compassion for the hardships incident to our human lot, have appointed a cycle of their festivals to provide relief from this fatigue, besides giving us the Muses, their leader Apollo, and Dionysus, to share these festivals with us and to keep them right, with all the spiritual sustenance these deities bring to the feast. The principle of public religious feasts involving freedom from work was contemplative, so that participation in the religious feasts gave to all a glimpse of the divine realm that transcends us. And as that principle has been lost in our society, it is perhaps not surprising that other ways of valuing the contemplative, for instance, the institute universities themselves, has ceased even to be understood. Scholastate kegnote oti ego eimi theos. Have leisure and know that I am God. A fairly literal translation of the Greek Bible, the Septuagint, of the psalm verse rendered in the English translation of the Hebrew as, be still and know that I am God. Originally, the university, the academy, would have recognized its purpose in that psalm verse, while at the same time acknowledging that elsewhere, here on earth in prayer and worship, and in a life devoted to prayer and worship, that purpose was fulfilled. It would also recognize that the ultimate fulfillment of that verse was only to be found in heaven, so that in a way, the university itself is a preparation for heaven, rather than being, as we experience it nowadays, a rehearsal for purgatory. But let me end with the words with which St. Augustine closed his great work, The City of God. He has just mentioned the final seventh day of humanity that will find fulfillment in heaven. And he continues, this seventh will be our Sabbath, and its end will not be an evening, but the Lord's day, the eighth eternal day, sanctified by the resurrection of Christ, which prefigures the eternal rest of both spirit and body. There we shall be still, vacabimus, the Latin equivalent of scholasome, and shall see and love, shall love and praise. Behold, what will be in the end without end? For what else is our end, except to reach the kingdom that has no end? Or in Augustine's peerless Latin, ibi vecabimus et videbimus, videbimus et amabimus, amabimus et laudabimus, ecce quod erit in fine sine fine, nam quis alius nostra est finis, nisi pervenire ad regnum cuius nullus est finis. Thank you for your patience.
So, thank you so much, Father Andrew. This is the book that we translate for this event. It's a translation of one book that I think you missed, Modern Orthodox Thinkers. You mentioned it? Okay. I missed it. One chapter is very important here in this. That's the last chapter. In the last chapter, Father Andrew says that Metropolitan Callistus is of greatest importance for the English-speaking Orthodox Church and largely responsible for how Orthodoxy is understood in West. That's largely his service. The entire chapter in the end is a homage to Metropolitan Callistus. And I said in the beginning of his conference that some of the scholars has been present in. This award is not just an award to Father Andrew, but for the entire British School of Orthodox Theology, which has its father on this side, Metropolitan Callistus, and a lot of fruits in this room. I am most convinced that Father Andrew is just one in a long line of British Orthodox scholars that will receive the Order of Sankt Ignatios. What Saint Serge was in the larger part of the 20th century is now what the British Orthodox School is today, and largely because Metropolitan Callistus. So I'd extended thanks both to Father Andrew and to Metropolitan Callistus for making this school an opportunity in the present Orthodox world. It will have its roots in the 21st century. And a lot of you that are present here are part of his success. It's in itself a miracle, and a marvelous miracle. On the back side of the book, it's written, which is now a truth. Andrew Louth is a priest in the Russian Orthodox Church and a professor emeritus in patristics and Byzantine studies at University of Durham, England. He is considered one of the most important contemporary Orthodox theologians and was rewarded the Order of Sankt Ignatios in Sigtuna 2019. And thereby I close the Order of Sankt Ignatios, and there's a dinner now. And is there anyone who will make a more detailed instruction about this? No, it's just go to the dinner hall. So I close this by extending this book to Father Andrew Louth. I know you don't read Swedish, but you have an opportunity. And I think that Professor Thomas Grauman will help you.